Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Summer Session Online. I'm Heather Biro, Director of Principia Lifelong Learning. This is our 5th program in the series, and it brings me such joy to know folks are tuning in right now from all over the United States and in several countries around the world. Please feel free to do a little shout out in the chat box, letting us know where you are right now. I hope you're enjoying the exploration of religion, history, art, and music that our PLL faculty have provided this past week and a half. We're so grateful for the research, preparation, and enthusiasm they've put into this programming. While we're still in the midst of summer session 2021, we're already planning for 2022. And if you're joining us this Saturday for our summer session social, which I hope you all are, you'll have an opportunity to share with us what subjects and programs you'd like to experience with next year's program. We'll also be looking for input on travel destinations that you'd like us to consider for future PLL trips. Your ideas and suggestions drive these programs, so we look forward to hearing from you. Also on the docket for Saturday's social, music, games, and golf carts. Don't miss out on what is sure to be a fun event. I imagine you've been looking forward to part 2 of the Gospel of Thomas. Last week, Dr. Shirley Paulson introduced us to the book. Personally, I found it fascinating, and I know I left last week's talk hungry for more. And this evening, we reunite with Shirley as she takes a closer look at some of the content of the book and considers some of the Gnostic accusations in the context of Christian Science. We're certain there will be a lot of questions, so I'll be joined with my colleague, Leadership Gift Officer Robbie Butler. He'll be administering the polls this evening and then monitoring and moderating the Q&A box for your questions. We'll be sure to allot time for Shirley to respond. We shared a little bit about Shirley during the intro of part 1, and I want to let you know that there are several books forthcoming this year which Shirley helped author. She contributed a chapter in Westar Institute's forthcoming book, After Jesus, Before Christianity, a historical exploration of the first 2 centuries of Jesus' movements. This book is due to be out in November of this year. Her own book, titled Illuminating the Secret Revelation of John, Catching the Light, is also due out in the late fall. And Shirley has also co-authored a new book due out next week, titled An Annotated Bibliography of Academic and Other Literature on Christian Science, just in time to celebrate the bicentennial of the birth of Mary Baker Eddy. We've got a lot of great reading material to look forward to, but now, without any further delay, I pass the screen to Shirley, and I say, hello, Shirley, good evening, and thank you for joining us again.
Oh, thanks so much, Heather and Robbie. I so appreciate this. Let me get myself pulled together, and we'll be right together here. I think we're on the same page now, so good. Well, greetings, everybody. I'm so glad to see you, or at least to know you're there. Whether you were with us last week or not, I presume you've already figured out that the Gospel of Thomas is something pretty important for Christian scientists to know about. If you didn't hear me say it last week, I want to emphasize again right now that I think we are at this moment making history in an important way. That's because we have something to say about the Gospel of Thomas that can make a huge contribution. This ancient text is doing a great deal of stirring, especially among Christians. I think our engagement with it will touch us and help us become aware of our particular gift to share with the world at this time in history. My hope is that you'll feel informed enough when we're finished today, and you'll see why our experience in Christian Science gives us an important foundation for bringing light to this amazing topic. So I'm going to start with a poll asking you some questions about this, just so we get a kind of feel for where we all are together on this. So here are 3 questions to get us going. First one is, do you know why the Gospel of Thomas is not in the Bible?
And we are launching our first poll. So you should see popping up on your screen that exact question with multiple choice responses, really only 2 though. And the answer is either yes or no, and choose wisely based on your own experience so far. Given the fact that we're about 75% done, I take it you all can see it, and we'll give you about 6.5 more seconds to respond to this poll. You know why the Gospel of Thomas is not in the Bible? And we've hit a solid 81%. So 2 more seconds, I'll end this poll.
Okay.
And the results we can see are 67% say no, they don't know why the Gospel of Thomas is not in the Bible. 67% saying no.
All right, that's interesting. So a third of you are pretty sure you know why, and some of you don't. And so actually my answer is I don't really know, but we're going to kind of learn some of these ideas together. So we'll think about this one. So the second question now is, do you know how to define Gnosticism, which will be a topic for tonight? So again, it's just a yes or no. What do you think?
Again, you've got 2 options and choose wisely. Be forever judged on this one response to this one quiz question. I'll give you about 5 more seconds. And all righty. Thanks to all for contributing. And with this question, we've got 78% saying no. They don't know how to define Gnosticism. 78% saying no.
Okay, and some of you do know how to define it, which is great. The interesting thing is that probably those of you who say no will be appreciate what I have to say about that. I think you're in good company. Okay, and the third question, do you know what Mrs. Eddy says about Gnosticism?
And that poll has launched as well. Got actually the same answers to the previous questions. You have yes and you have no. All righty, about 5 more seconds and then we will take it back to Shirley. Thanks to all for participating. And here we have the answers.
I'm sure there's always somebody who's memorized everything that Mary Baker already ever said, but anyway, let's see.
That would be a useful trait.
So you're on mute. Yeah.
So we've got 92%.
You're still on mute. I can't hear you.
Well, Shirley, I believe everyone
I'm
else
on mute.
should be able to. We shall see. 92% are saying no.
Let's see here. Do you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. And it shows other people can hear me, so it might be on your
Let's
end.
see here.
Let's see what we can do.
I got it. We're fixed. I'm with you now.
Welcome back. That's great.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the answer is then that we have a lot of people who don't know what she said, which is great because then we have something to learn tonight. So wonderful. Thank you so much, Robbie, for showing us these polls here.
My pleasure.
Right. So we will move on then. All right. So let me just give a tiny bit of background on what's in the Gospel of Thomas. For those of you who were not here with us last week, the main thing you need to know is that the Gospel of Thomas is really a collection of sayings of Jesus. There are 114 of these sayings in the book, and that's actually the whole book. There are no stories, no birth and death stories, no healing stories. Of course, that's also true of most of the other New Testament books, but we just need to know that about this book too. So we'll start with that first question in the poll. Why is the Gospel of Thomas not in the Bible? My hope is that by the end of this discussion, you'll wonder even more about that. By thinking about why it should be in the Bible, you'll get a feel for some of the issues that this book raises for us. It has been hailed internationally by millions of people. Lots of people are really appreciating it. I have to move this, and just a minute. There we go. Okay. So a lot of people have been paying attention to it, and also it has lots of content in common with the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke. And it also has 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, about half of which are new to us now. That's rather astonishing to think about. I have to go back. It also portrays Jesus in similar ways as in the New Testament, both divine and powerful. So I want to dive in and show you some examples of this. We're going to start with saying 77. Here's an example of Jesus claiming his divinity. He says in saying 77, I am the light which is above them all. I am the all. The all has come forth from me. Lift the stone, you'll find me there. Split the piece of wood, I am there. And then there's another one. This is saying 61 that also shows where Jesus is expressing himself, understanding his self understanding as his own divinity. So Jesus said to Salome, I am from the equality. I was endowed with what belongs to my Father. Therefore, I tell you, whoever becomes equal will be filled with light, but if divided, full of darkness. Well, as we've already seen, we can't just rush over these sayings. Each one has so much to think about it. But the way I see this one is it means that Jesus claims his relationship with the Father and that others can be part of the realm of reality, of equality also. Isn't that an interesting statement of social justice? And then here's another saying, number 31. This is showing his very kind of human way of thinking of himself. He says, Jesus said, no prophet is accepted in his or her own village. No physician heals those who know him. And now I want to look at some examples of sayings that sound quite a bit like the Bible. Within the first 9 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, right from the beginning, we have quite a few of those. So, for example, in saying number 2, let the one who seeks keep seeking until he or she finds. This is quite a bit like Matthew 7, Luke 9 to 11, Luke 11, 9 to 10. Let's see here. I'm not advancing the slide. Okay, I think we're there. All right, this is saying 3. All right, yeah, we're on saying 3 now. So the kingdom or the realm is within you. This is saying number 3. And again, this is like Luke 17, 21. Now, what I want to mention here, as I did last week, that this phrase, the realm of God, is often used by scholars these days instead of kingdom because it implies a powerful lord or master instead of a realm of equal worth. The Greek and Coptic word doesn't really translate well into English, so this word realm seems more satisfying these days. I think I wanted you to see that. And now I'm saying 4. So many who are first will become last. This is saying 4. And it's like Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and Luke 13. I have to make sure we're there. Okay, there we are. Okay. And now they're saying 5. There's nothing hidden that will not become obvious. This is like Matthew 10, Mark 4, and Luke 8. As you can see, there are many more, but you get the idea. Of the first 50 sayings, 37 of them are very similar to what's in the Bible. If you would read the Gospel of John, we wouldn't find near as many connections to the rest of the New Testament as we actually find here in the Gospel of Thomas. So the big question then becomes, how and when was the Bible put together, rather than whether someone actually chose not to include it? So let's consider a couple of points about how the Bible was put together without the Gospel of Thomas. Number 1, there wasn't ever any big church council that decided for or against putting the Gospel of Thomas in the Bible. And number 2, okay, there you go. Number 2, there aren't any church fathers or mothers who criticize the Gospel of Thomas. So we can ask what criteria some church leaders used to decide what texts would be in the Bible. We just don't have any good answers as to why some texts do and some don't get into the Bible. As late as the Council of Trent in the 16th century, there were still disputes about which texts should and should not be in the canon of the Bible. They argued over the book of James or the book of Revelation, but not the Gospel of Thomas. So we just don't have any good evidence of why it is or isn't in the Bible. So now let's consider a couple of points about when it was written. Was it written too early or too late to be included? As you probably realize, the Bible didn't just get written all at once or appear suddenly as a single book to be used by Christians. All of the books in the New Testament were written at different times in the first two centuries, before there was any Christian church, before there was any church council, before there was any church doctrine or dogma. The Christian Bible or New Testament wasn't complete at the end of the second century, but there was discussion about what groups of texts people ought to read. There just wasn't any official or council to make that decision. So the best guesses about when the Gospel of Thomas was written seem to fall within the same range of dates as the texts included in the New Testament, between 60 and 180. Now, there are more factors that leave us with a cloud over the answer. It really wasn't until the 6th through the 9th centuries that there was a slow coming together of a real New Testament. During the first 10 centuries, there was a small amount of criticism about the Gospel of Thomas. And also, there was some confusion in those first 10 centuries between the Gospel of Thomas and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Even though they are completely different books, people got them confused just because their names were so similar. So let's pause here and give you a chance to ask your questions or think about what we've been talking about, your thoughts, some pushback, or whatever you'd like to ask about.
Well, anyone is welcome to submit questions in, and we're excited to have them along, and we'll continue our question pauses throughout the rest of the talk.
Okay.
But Shirley, could you tell us, as you know, these different councils all the way through the history of Christianity, which ones are perhaps of highest priority to know about?
Well, it's interesting that they have different reasons for being why they're important. The one that's most commonly known and understood is the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. That was really important because that's the one that sort of set the stage for making things official, that this is Christianity and this is not Christianity. And they did not decide on a canon then. That didn't even occur to them to think about that at that time. What they were most interested then was about the meaning of Jesus or Christ. It was a Christology question. In other words, who is Jesus? Is he human or divine? That was the big question at Nicaea. Then, of course, there were other councils that were important along the way, but none of them really settled on looking at a canon. That just wasn't the issue of the councils. They were just much more interested in doctrine and questions about Jesus and Christ.
Sure thing. Well, just like this afternoon, we have other friends joining us here who are asking about the infant Gospel of Thomas. Shall we save that for the end, or would you like to go into it now?
Well, I may as well since it came up. Thanks. I know I mentioned the Infancy Gospel of Thomas because it was confused with the Gospel of Thomas. So you should just know that there were quite a few texts that were related to Thomas. And Thomas didn't really write this, at least not as far as we can tell. But they're kind of associated with him just because he might have been a teacher of some groups of people, or they might have wanted to sound like they were Thomas. We don't really know Thomas's real relationship with him, but I can tell you that the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is really different from this Gospel of Thomas. And the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, it's a little bit misleading to call it an infancy because it has to do with when Jesus was a child, not really a baby. But the stories about his childhood are really bizarre. The point of that book is trying to prove that Jesus was a Superman, a superhero. So, of course, as a superhero, he never had a time to grow up or have to learn things because he already knew things. So the Infancy Gospel is telling us stories about super child Jesus. And he did such things as outsmarting his teacher and telling his friends that he could do whatever he wanted, like killing them if he wanted to. And evidently he even did that. So all that is to show that Jesus is a superhero. That's not at all like what's going on in the Gospel of Thomas, even though they have similar names.
Fantastic. Well, we're again seeing similar parallel questions. What is the story? If the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 1945, how then was it up for interpretation back then? And what's the issue with the timeline here that would cause that iteration?
Yeah, okay. So we will get into the timeline more specifically coming up here. So, but I'll just say that you're right. The earliest, the gospel was probably written in the same time that the other New Testament books were written, but it was lost somewhere along the line, and we don't know why. But we just know that when it was found again in modern history in 1945, people began to realize that this was the ancient text. And we'll talk about what happened during that time between the time it was written and the time it was rediscovered. So we'll get into that timeline next.
Perfect. And then one last fast one.
Good.
Someone's asking for a quick recap on who Thomas was for those of us who missed last week.
Yeah, Thomas. Okay, so this is referring to Thomas, the disciple of Jesus, one of the 12 men. And he, in the Gospels and the canon, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we only really see Thomas in the Gospel of John and in not very good light. Mrs. Eddy refers to him as the dull disciple, which is all she had access to, was the story about Thomas in that gospel where, you know, that's when Thomas doubts that Jesus actually had a resurrection. And that's really all we know about him. He's not really doing much but doubting. But anyway, there are other stories about Thomas that are much more enlightening. And he's sharing a lot of deeply spiritual thoughts that we see, especially here in the Gospel of Thomas. Again, I don't know if he wrote this. In fact, I kind of doubt it. But he is associated with a lot of deep spiritual thoughts, especially spiritual things. So we don't know that much about what happened other than the fact that the disciples seem to have gone off into different places after they were after Jesus left them. But he was particularly specifically sent to the east. So he went off to Syria, and that's his sort of territory where people find his text and things about Thomas. Should we get going on to the rest of the things?
That would be my vote. We'll have another round of questions in a couple of minutes.
Great, then. Okay, then. Well, there is another question about the Gospel of Thomas and its relationship to the Bible that touches on the hot button and gets people wound up. Was it excluded from the Bible because it really was an evil heresy created by the devil to sow confusion and distrust of the Christian Bible? We need to explore this question because this is where the public usually focuses their attention on the Gospel of Thomas and not even actually what it's saying. Last week, we looked at some of the history of when the Gospel of Thomas reappeared in modern history in relation to Mary Baker Eddy. And we'll have a very quick review of that right now and then move on into our own times because it relates to this question of heresy that we'll talk about. So in 1897, scholars discovered 3 papyrus fragments of the lost sayings of Jesus. These little fragments were dating back to around 140, again, around the time of the pastoral epistles. And that would be Timothy and Titus from the New Testament. On the 3 papyrus fragments are found 8 sayings. These scholars who found them claimed they're not heretical. These are really Christian. All right, so Mrs. Eddy passed on in 1910. And so what follows is beyond her human story. In 1945, the complete Gospel of Thomas is found in Egypt. And you should realize that this is still this is the only full text known in the modern world of the Gospel of Thomas. There's only one. Well, with this chronology in mind, we have 2 quotes from Mary Baker Eddy to consider. The first one is now published in Miscellaneous Writings, but it was from a sermon that she delivered in 1888. And this is 1 year before even those little fragments were discovered. And she's talking about Jesus here. The third event of this eventful period, a period of such wonderful spiritual import to mankind, was the advent of a higher Christianity. From this dazzling, God-crowned summit, the Nazarene stepped suddenly before the people and their schools of philosophy, Gnostic, Epicurean, and Stoic. He must stem these rising angry elements and walk serenely over their fretted, foaming billows. Well, that's very strong language that says Jesus opposed the rising angry elements, such as the Gnostic. Of course, this is the answer to the third question in our opening poll. Do you know what Mrs. Eddy said about Gnosticism? This is the only mention she makes about Gnostic anything in her writing, in her published writings, and I haven't yet found any other references in her writings. We should note that this is an accurate statement about the scholarly view of Gnostic things in her day. This is essentially what the church fathers had left us in history, since all these original writings had disappeared. Remember that history is always recorded by the victors, so no one in modern history had a chance to know what these so-called Gnostics actually said back in 1888. And then the main thing that we saw last week was Mrs. Eddy's enthusiastic response to her first look at the fragments. This really grabbed her attention. So now this is in July of 1903. After these fragments had been found and she's had a chance to see them, Mrs. Eddy wrote to her cousin Alfred Baker, "Oh, I wish you could see a book just sent to me from a professor in Great Britain, giving the words of Christ that have been found in a recently discovered logia, recent excavation, and words not in the canonical Gospels, and 200 or 300 years before the Christian era. These words correspond precisely with some of my writings in Science and Health. I only wish the students would all awaken to see the wisdom of what God says through his window." Now, she had no way of knowing that these sayings were associated with the Gospel of Thomas, or even that the Gospel of Thomas might somehow later become associated with the Gnostic world. So again, we're going to run quickly through the history of what happened to the thoughts about the Gospel of Thomas since 1910 to understand where we are now. I missed something. Let's see. Okay, got it. Sorry about that. So in 1945, this is now 35, no, it's not. There we go. Oh, I'm so sorry. My screens are not doing the same thing here.
Shirley, we are seeing the Nag Hammadi text, and
That's what you should be seeing. I'm with you now. Okay.
excellent.
So, thank you very much. And so in 1945, and now this is now 35 years after Mrs. Eddy's passing, the first and only copy of the Gospel of Thomas was discovered. But it's important to realize that no one made the connection between this book and those early fragments that were written in Greek. These were found near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and written in the Coptic, which is an Egyptian language. It was just a whole new book. Scholars had known of the existence of the Gospel of Thomas since the church fathers had made reference to it, and those references had been preserved. But modern scholars had never seen it before this time, so they didn't recognize those fragments as part of this long lost gospel. Then in 1959, 14 years later, another scholar made the connection that these 3 Greek fragments of the sayings of Jesus found in the 19th century were actually part of the Gospel of Thomas. But then a few years later, in the 1960s, scholars began to identify the Gospel of Thomas as Gnostic. As we saw from Mrs. Eddy's quote, we know that Gnostic was bad. And now that people began to associate the Gospel of Thomas with the other texts in the Nag Hammadi collection, they changed their mind about the Gospel of Thomas. And it actually became guilty simply by association with Nag Hammadi. So you can see that by itself, it was an amazing collection of new sayings of Jesus. But interpretations of it began to change when it was associated with something it wasn't previously associated with. All right, now a perfect example of reinterpretation like this is saying 22. This is the one that we discussed last week. Let's take a look. Here is saying 22. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female into a solitary one, so that the male is not male, nor the female female, then you will enter the realm. Well, looking at it later with the lens of heresy, it began to sound like it was about finding our spiritual counterpart or disparaging a world created by a false god. Now, that's not even in the text, but they read that into it when they feared it's being tainted by a heretical association. Now, don't worry yet if you don't know what Gnosticism is. I'll explain that in a little bit, but for now, you just need to know that the accusations of Gnosticism were the center of the heresy disputes that came much later than when the text was written. Thinking that the Gospel of Thomas was Gnostic because it was associated with other texts in the Nag Hammadi library changed some scholars' minds about when it was written. They assumed that Gnostic things were written to oppose the Bible. So the Gospel of Thomas must have been written after the New Testament writings. The reason this discussion is important to Christian scientists is that there are deeply spiritual ideas in the Gospel of Thomas that are quite similar to the teachings of Christian Science. And the treatment of the Gospel of Thomas tells us something important about the way the world views the similar teachings of Christian Science. So, back to the 1960s again. Other scholars argue back against those claims that Thomas was a later Gnostic reaction against the Bible. These other scholars claimed that these sayings represented oral versions of Jesus' sayings, and so they were not dependent on or reacting to New Testament manuscripts. And now, by the 1970s, more scholars of the Gospel of Thomas began to agree that this gospel really represents Jesus as a wise sage, since it is based only on Jesus' message and not on the later developments of the church. It was not dependent upon New Testament documents. For example, the text includes no tradition of the cross or atonement theology. It includes no apocalyptic end of the world. Those things were developed later by the church, well after Jesus had been teaching. So it's not against the Bible, that is the Gospel of Thomas. Well, then later, in the 20th century, in the 1990s, another scholar, Helmut Kester, thought that the Gospel of Thomas began a trajectory of Gnostic entity. And so you can see the debate continued. Now, finally, in the 21st century, including now, scholars are less inclined to see early Gnosticism in the Gospel of Thomas. And there are several reasons. This is where the cutting edge scholarship is today. Gnosticism is a category in need of revision. And also, much of what has passed as strains of Gnosticism in early texts are now seen as part of a resurging interest in Plato back in the 100s and 200s. Plato? What did Plato have to do with all this? Actually, a great deal. You may remember that Plato was writing in about the 4th century before Jesus. But around the time of Jesus, and for a few hundred years afterward, there was a resurgent interest in Plato's ideas. Since he was Greek, this was known as the Hellenistic Influence. One of the main ideas of Plato was that reality was truly in the realm of ideas, and that the material world was more like a shadow of the real things. And the main contribution he made that some of these early Christian writers latched onto was the fact that he explained the existence of this shadowy world by saying some other false creator made it, not the true creator God. It seemed to be a powerful new way of explaining how evil could appear so real when God is good. But those who opposed these ideas said that they were against the Bible. After all, the Bible says there's one creator God. And so clearly, God created the material world, as the reasoning goes. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with this battle. And there's another reason Christian scientists ought to be familiar with what's going on with these issues. So the third point about the cutting edge of new scholarship today is the fact that in some other ancient writings, you can find ideas that look like the material world is a cosmic mistake, created by a subordinate and rebellious creator God. This is another type of Gnostic accusation, but it's not in the Gospel of Thomas. Right now, it seems the scholars are split nearly in half, arguing rather intensely over whether the Gospel of Thomas represents an evil heresy known as Gnosticism, and the other half saying this is an important addition to our understanding of what Jesus really said. I'll just say that the number of those who are taking the Gospel of Thomas seriously as an important teaching about Jesus is growing. The major swing in scholarly thought is important in our understanding of Mrs. Eddy's response to it. Let's see. I missed again, so let me see if I can get this connected again. We'll get there. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we were there. So there we go. Okay. So the major swing in scholarly thought is important in our understanding of Mrs. Eddy's response to it. First, we can see that she agreed with the best scholars of her day who taught that Gnosticism was a terrible heresy. They were going by what the early church fathers had said before they had a chance to see the real texts that were discovered in 1945. This shows why this discovery at Nag Hammadi was so really crucial. Second, we also see that when Mrs. Eddy had a chance to see even a little scrap of the original text, she was not only interested, but she felt they corresponded precisely with some of her writings in Science and Health. Again, another quote of hers. This major, whoops. Okay. And so once again, she is right with the most current scholarship on the subject. And I think that's an important point about Mrs. Eddy, that she was always right with the leading scholarship. So what I find most amazing in all of this, these writings that do correspond so closely with her writings, are that increasingly they're catching the attention of the scholars who are studying it the most. And this is probably the key reason that I'm personally so involved in these studies. It seems that this is opening the door to serious conversation about both Mrs. Eddy's ideas and the earliest thinking and writing closest to Jesus. The things that Orthodox Christianity find most incorrect about Christian Science turn out to be the things that were most similar to the expressions of these earliest Christ people. So now we need to talk about Gnosticism itself. Interestingly, if you don't know what it is, then you probably have the best definition of it. It's a terribly confusing word because it actually has almost no meaning. If there ever was a subject that fit Shakespeare's aphorism, much ado about nothing, to the extreme, this would be it. And yet almost every time you might talk about the Gospel of Thomas in public, invariably somebody's going to bring up Gnosticism in a negative way. Unfortunately, this word has gotten in the way of people getting to know and appreciate the Gospel of Thomas. And I dare say the same is true for Christian Science to some degree. People associate Christian Science with Gnosticism in a negative way and steer clear of it for that reason. Okay, so what is it? Well, it's really a made-up word that actually means nothing more than a vague notion of bad Christianity. As we've seen in these two lectures, somewhere between 1850 and 2000, people became increasingly aware of some ancient writings from the beginnings of the Jesus and Christ movements that were discovered in Egypt. Some of them sounded quite a bit like the New Testament part of the Bible. Others had similarities, but also significant differences. And others were just strange or curious. But all of them were verified as authentic ancient texts by carbon dating. Frankly, these discoveries frightened many people. They didn't match up with what they had expected from the earliest Jesus movements. Many scholars got involved in translating them and trying to make sense of them. And because they were so different from what everybody thought about the early church, these new texts felt threatening. So let's test it out just among us. How many of you knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls before you ever heard of the Nag Hammadi collection? I don't really want to stop and take a poll right now, but just sort of answer for yourself. I know I certainly did. Even now, if you are more familiar with or comfortable with the Dead Sea Scrolls than the Nag Hammadi text, then you are also like those scholars who first encountered them. Both sets of texts were discovered in the same year, 1945. But you can see these discoveries are very different places. The Dead Sea is in Israel, and Nag Hammadi is in central Egypt, near the Nile River. Scholars were excited about the Dead Sea Scrolls because mostly they confirmed what they thought they knew about the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. But the Nag Hammadi collection included texts that were quite different from what anybody expected. And scholars haven't known quite what to do about that. For quite a while, scholars just thought these texts from Nag Hammadi were inferior or just strange or contained heresies. Some of it was just like the Bible, but some was different. The texts are also all different from each other. So not knowing what they were or what to call them, they called them Gnosticism. Still not exactly understanding what it meant, scholars tried to find categories to explain it. You can see how easily Christian Science could get wrapped up in this Gnosticism mess. Christian Science is based on the Bible, includes a lot of things related to the Bible, but it sounds contradictory to the way the mainstream church has always understood the Bible. After naming these unfamiliar things with the umbrella term Gnosticism, scholars then began to try to explain what Gnosticism is. Was it more than a name of a major heresy for the Christian church? Or was it the name of a particular set of newly discovered texts? Was there an actual movement called Gnosticism? Well, the more scholars have tried to identify what makes Gnosticism, the more complicated it became. Scholars just haven't been able to agree on what it might be, other than a label for a heretical group. I hear so many explanations for Gnosticism, and the best one I've heard is, I don't know what it is, but it's a heresy. So in 2021, a little more than half of the scholars of the Jesus-related literature of the first 2 centuries tell the story of Gnosticism as a label for heretical groups and otherwise inexplicable, recently discovered documents. But more and more scholars like me have just quit using the term. It's misleading and doesn't say anything meaningful. So now we have just a few, and now we should have just a few words about heresy. The issue of heresy is also an important one for the Gospel of Thomas and for Christian Science. I don't know if you've ever been called a heretic or not. I have. And in certain circles of Christian communities, they teach that Christian Science is a heresy, mostly because it's thought of as a modern day type of Gnosticism. All right, a good definition of heresy is a belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine, especially Christian doctrine. But what we need to understand is that, in fact, there never was an agreed upon set of beliefs or practices or opinions in the history of the different kinds of Christianities. So we might ask, was there heresy in the first 2 centuries? An important answer here is that technically there couldn't have been any official position of heresy because the term Christian didn't even exist during those first couple of centuries. Jesus was a Jew. Paul was a Jew. They never considered themselves anything but Jews. It actually took another couple of hundred years for the followers of Jesus to call themselves Christian in a positive way. So if there weren't any Christians, there wasn't anything you could call opposition to Orthodox religious doctrine yet. And related to that point, since there was no official church home, there was really no one in charge of all the different kinds of people following Jesus. So there were no authorities who could decide who was a heretic and what was wrong. This came about much later at the Council of Nicaea that we discussed earlier, which was in the 4th century. With the Gospel of Thomas, we're still talking about the 100s and 200s now. So the idea of heresy is not meaningless, though. Just as the Jews disputed between themselves over Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, there were always disagreements among Jesus's followers too. Even among his own disciples, they argued over who was better or who was more right. So the struggle to push others out was nothing new. It's just that the meaning of Christian heresy is not very clear, and it did not come from the right and wrong position of Christianity from the beginning. So was there Christianity in the first 2 centuries? There couldn't have been then, but later, and it depends on who you ask. So I think this is a good place to stop again and ask if there's some more questions or thoughts about this before we dig into the actual sayings that represent some of these questions. So let's just think about where we are now with this. Are there some questions, Robbie?
Absolutely,
Yes.
especially at this stage. So, an individual asks that their understanding of Gnosticism was that a key element was that death brings salvation. So, based on what you're saying, does that still ring true, or is that just one more thread of a very tangled web?
That's definitely a tangled part of the story. It's so interesting that there are a number of kind of cliches about Gnosticism. The thing about Gnosticism tends to be that, well, first of all, it's kind of interesting to see how Gnostics are often accused of being both too hedonistic and also aesthetic, meaning that they are too pure and too sinful at the same time. That right there tells you there's a problem trying to understand what they're saying. As far as death is concerned, I think a more common way of understanding Gnostic thought is that they're extra special people because they're spiritual and they don't die and they just live in another realm far away from the material world. So in that way, they talk about death being a kind of a different way. I think the main thing I think we see in Gnostic accusations has to do with being too spiritual. There are other cliches I could get into later, but that's kind of the basic one.
Sure thing.
Yeah.
Well, stepping back into the Gospel of Thomas specifically, an
Okay.
individual asks, why is this called the Gospel if it's not a biography such as others?
Yeah, I wondered about that for a while too. It's interesting that a gospel, it means actually good news. That's what it really means. And so it happens that among the books that were collected and put into the Bible, those gospels tell stories, narratives, but not all gospels tell narratives, just like not all books in the New Testament tell narratives. So we have letters, as you know, that don't, well, some letters do tell stories, but not that many. And the Acts of the Apostles tell stories, but Gospels really are categorized by telling the good news. In other words, what is Jesus telling us? So the Gospel really has more to do with being close to Jesus himself.
Fantastic. Well, are there different translations of the Gospel of Thomas that we could use to look into it in perhaps English today?
Yeah, since it's in Coptic, most of us probably don't know much Coptic. I've learned some, but not enough to really read the whole text. And so fortunately it has been translated into English. And I think it's interesting how the earliest translations of it are somewhat difficult to even follow what they mean, because I think they're trying to use the exact meaning of those words that don't make much sense to us today. Some of the newer translations kind of get at the idea a little more clearly, and those ideas do tend to be pretty spiritually focused. So there are a number of good translations. You can find many of them online, and I think it's a good idea to compare them to see which ones you like best. You can even just look up Gospel of Thomas online and see several translations right away. There are some that I can recommend in book form. This book, A New Testament, has a good translation of it in it. Also, Charlie Hedrick has a nice translation that I use often. And also on gospels.net, Mark Madison has some good translations that I like too. So those are some of my favorites.
One last question we'll go into right now.
Okay.
An individual looks back over 60 years ago and says, when opinions were coming forward at that time, what religions were the scholars that were taking such strong stands? Were they affiliated with different religious groups or more independent scholars?
All right. So did you say 60 years ago? I just want to make sure I got you right. Yeah.
Yes. In the 50s and 60s, when we first saw a wave of opinion come about Gnosticism and gospel.
Well, so that's a good question to sort of get our heads around this, because in the 60s is when there was a very strong pull toward the fear of Gnosticism itself. So, for example, that Mrs. Eddy said was referring to the Gnostics in a very negative way, and that was what the teaching was, that they were the heretics who were evil and opposing the Bible. So when they began to think about these Nag Hammadi texts, some of the things that were so different for them were just not like orthodoxy. And you see, it was in 1945 that it was found. It took a long time to translate these and try to make sense of them. So it makes sense that in the 60s and even 70s is when they thought these are sounding too dangerous. They're too unlike the church that we've always known. So that's why they became Gnostic. Now, I will say that the term Gnosticism was coined in the 17th century, and we'll talk about that maybe later. But I think it's important to realize that back then they didn't even have a chance to see any text. They just knew that what the church fathers said about Gnostic was really bad, and so they just assumed that when they found these texts, this must be what the church fathers were talking about that was so bad. So that's why it's taken a long time for scholars to look at them again and again and again and think, what are they actually saying? And only recently, even in the last 2 years, I would say, some of the scholars who are studying this the most are saying that these texts can't be categorized in anything that makes any sense, calling them Gnostic. And maybe they were in the majority instead of in the minority back in the time of Jesus. So your question was also, who's saying this? It just seemed that the majority of scholars in the 60s and 70s were saying that they were Gnostic, and then that has been shifting to people who are finding that is not so heretical or evil. So in a general way, you can see that the people who are angry about it or upset about it or thinking it's rocking the boat would be the more conservative people, and the more liberal ones are saying, well, let's take another look at this, and maybe it should just be what it is and not something that's so necessarily evil. So in that sense, you can see that there are scholars who are maybe following along a more conservative line, have held that these texts are heretical sins, and the more liberal ones are saying, I think we should take another look, and they're willing to even consider the meaning of these spiritual ideas, which is difficult because they've not run across this in their own orthodox teachings. Hope that kind of gets at the answer a little bit.
I think it does.
Going?
I would say yes. Let's keep going. We can come back to one final round in a moment.
All right, then. Very good. All right. So then, what is it about the Gospel of Thomas that resonates with Christian Science? Last week, we saw evidence that these sayings of Jesus recorded in the Gospel of Thomas correspond quite often with the sayings, especially in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In other ways, some sayings are more like the Gospel of John, as they highlight ideas such as light and life and similar themes. So I think of Thomas as almost like a bridge between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of John. And in that way, it expands our perception of the Bible itself. One of the distinctive features I find in the Gospel of Thomas is its emphasis on a return to origins. That's very different from the kind of apocalyptic teachings that say, look out, the end is coming. So let's take a look at saying 18 for an example of this. The disciples said to Jesus, tell us about our future end. Jesus replied, so you understand all about the beginning and now you look toward the end? You will find the end at the beginning. Whoever stands at the beginning is favored, for they will know the end and never die. Think of how many times you may have tried to explain Christian Science by going back to Genesis 1. I bet you most of us have. We use that argument all the time. This is how God made us, in the image and likeness of God. And this is just what Jesus is doing here in this saying. He explains that perfection of life is true from the beginning, and it includes no death. You can tell that this is quite different from mainstream Orthodox teaching, which is why you often get questions like this. Well, so do I. And that's a key to telling you that this is one of the ideas loosely associated with that word Gnosticism. That is, the focus is on regaining a clear understanding of our perfect origin, more than the apocalyptic way of saving us from all bad things. Here's another one that hints at the understanding of our origins. This is saying 70, where Jesus says, when you give birth to the one within you, that one will save you. If you do not have that one within you, that one will kill you. We always have to think about these things. Giving birth to the one within doesn't sound like pregnancy for all males and females. It sounds more like finding vitality for the real meaning of who we are. This might be telling us to know our divine origins. Without acting on this knowledge and allowing it to come alive, we would wither and die. So a key point that you'll notice in the Gospel of Thomas is its emphasis on understanding and knowing spiritual things. This is probably the part that is most antagonistic to Orthodox or mainstream Christianity. One of the main ideas that comes through the church fathers is that the true Christian believer is one who believes and doesn't have to know something in order to gain spiritual favors. Understanding is not necessary, and in fact, not even possible. The goal is to have faith and believe. But with the Gospel of Thomas, this theme is repeated in many different ways. You must understand God's ways, not earthly ways. Well, even though we find evidence of the virtue of understanding in the Bible, when mainstream Christians find it in the Gospel of Thomas, it seems like an affront. And that's what makes it feel Gnostic. The Greek word gnosis, which is the basis of Gnostic or Gnosticism, isn't easily translated into English. But we know what gnosis does. It brings about a satisfying awareness of where we've come from and where we're going. It's often translated as knowledge, but really that misses the uplifting and healing connotation. Gnosis is not a mark of superiority, but a gift from God for anyone who claims it. But because of its association with being an affront to the believing part of Christian practice, the word Gnosticism simply carries the heavy burden of being thought of as antichrist, that which opposes the Bible, the church, and Christianity. The fact that it is so often associated with evil and heresy is another reason I avoid using the word Gnosticism altogether. I'll use gnosis, but Gnosticism just doesn't sound like the knowledge of God's uplifting and healing presence. Here is saying 79, and this one illustrates the value of knowing and understanding. A woman in the crowd said to him, "The womb that bore you and the breast that nourished you are favored." He replied, "Those who heeded the Father's word and truly kept it are favored." Well, you may recognize this as a close parallel in the Gospel of Luke. Here's Luke 11. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just little parts of it so that you might remember it. Jesus appears to be, the woman says, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you. And then Jesus says, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Jesus appears to be elevating the discourse in both accounts with this woman to a spiritual level by insisting that hearing, understanding, and obeying the spiritual message from God brings forth blessings. This is an even greater act than the human mother giving birth and nourishing her baby. Now we're going to look at another Gospel of Thomas saying. This is saying 14. And I think this is of special interest to Christian Scientists because it involves both spiritual understanding and healing. Frankly, it's very difficult to explain this one outside of a Christian Science context when people are not familiar with metaphysical healing. I think it's one of the rare instances where Jesus is actually teaching his listeners how to heal. Let's take a look. Jesus said to them, if you fast, you will produce sin for yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits. And in whatever land you enter and in which you walk, if they receive you, eat whatever is put before you and heal the sick among them. For what goes into your mouth will not pollute you. Rather, that which comes out of your mouth will pollute you. Well, let's break it down a bit. It's not easy at first glance. Starting with, if you fast, you will produce sin for yourselves, etc. On the surface, this doesn't even sound like Jesus. Does he mean don't fast or pray or give alms? You probably remember what he says about fasting and praying and giving alms from the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6 of Matthew. Let's take a quick look at a comparison. In Matthew 6, whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And then whenever you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners so that they may be seen by others. And then whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Same thing with fasting. Whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites. When you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face so that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. Already, we see a parallel in these two Gospels because we see that Jesus is saying there's a danger in giving alms, praying, and fasting if you let others see you do it. And that's certainly consistent with the message we see in the Gospel of Thomas. Let's look at it again, saying 14. You probably noticed that Thomas is more directly to the point and quite brief here. That's usually the case in the comparison between the Gospel of Thomas and the synoptic Gospels in the Bible. One way to think about this is that one of them must have known about the other. They're so similar. So which one came first? Well, remember, this is the hot debate between the more liberal and evangelical styles of modern Christianity. Did Thomas get it from Matthew? Or did Matthew get it from Thomas? We just don't know. But one thing to consider is that if Thomas was the original, then Matthew might have thought there was too much ambiguity and that he ought to fill it in and explain it more fully. The debate over who said it first keeps leading to the Gnostic heresy question, but neglects the meaning of the teaching. I keep wondering when I hear all these discussions, what's really important? The substance of his teaching, or whether the Gospel of Thomas or the text in the Bible came first? I think we could say that whoever said it first, it's pretty clear that Jesus is really talking about this in the context of ministry. Wherever you go, whatever land you go to, your motive matters. That is, you can't succeed with God's power if you're doing it to show off. You can even get yourself in trouble if you do these things where people see you, because you may not even be sincere with yourself. Do you need others to see how righteous you are? Then the part about eating what is set before you. Here's that part of the quote. If they receive you, eat whatever is put before you and heal the sick among them. We can all think about this and find our own interpretations, but I'll share my own with you about this right now. I think the act of eating what is set before you when when you are a guest is a way of honoring your host. So the order of this teaching begins with don't let fasting, praying, and giving alms harm you by ruining your sincere spirit of love. The implication to me is that it's a given that you're going to fast and pray and give alms. Just don't let it become an excuse for self-glorification. When those motives are pure, you will be ready for ministry and you would welcome the gift of your host without reference to yourself. You love and cherish their worth. Then it seems to me it's no surprise that Jesus' followers are ready to heal. To me, this sounds quite similar to Mrs. Eddy's teaching about the woman who bathes Jesus' feet at the beginning of her chapter on the Christian Science practice. I also think there's something in here about the people who are receptive to healing too. That little phrase, if they receive you, tells us something about receptivity. It's interesting because the disciples are specifically instructed not to let their private prayers be made known publicly. So the people who are ready to receive them are those who are also unimpressed with public displays of virtue. Rather, they're just willing to give without rubbing elbows with the elite. And then finally, Jesus adds, for what goes into your mouth will not pollute you. Rather, that which comes from your mouth will pollute you. And now I'm hoping you remember another verse from the Gospel of Matthew. Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? And out of the heart come evil intentions and so forth. And to eat with unwashed hands is not defiled. That was in Matthew. Well, here again, the Gospel of Matthew has a little more explanation. In case you don't get it, Matthew explains just a little more explicitly. I think they mean the same thing. But this little addition in Matthew asserts the same message that food and circumstances can't hurt us. The point is that we can heal on the basis of a pure heart. And that's another good place to stop and check in on questions and thoughts before we come to our concluding parts of things. What do you think about this so far now?
Well, we've got one very good question about the context of the Nag Hammadi in its greater scope in all of the extra canonical books of the Bible, meaning all of the books out there that are not in our current Bible, extra canonical. Is there any comment you can make about all that the Nag Hammadi offers?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. You're right. So we need to keep in mind the fact that Nag Hammadi collection, which is 52 books, which is huge, is the biggest discovery of any time of ancient text in modern history. So that's why it was so huge. But remember that in 1887, oh dear, I'm forgetting the year, 1880, whatever it was, in the late 19th century was the beginning of the discovery of those little fragments. Those were found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, and that was kind of the beginning of a lot of discoveries. So all over Egypt, a lot of people, wealthy Europeans wanted to come to Egypt and do some exploring because they had enough money to do it. They were wanting to travel. Egypt had dry land. And so there was a lot of discoveries in the late 19th century. Well, so these things, and those texts were ranged from the 1st to the 7th century. So they found lots and lots and lots of other texts. So there are probably about 100 or a little more than 100 texts out there of things from the 1st, 2nd century alone. And that includes the 52 from Nag Hammadi. Now, some of those things from Nag Hammadi they knew of already, but many of them, like the Gospel of Thomas, they hadn't seen anywhere else. So Nag Hammadi is special that way. A very important thing I want to make clear about Nag Hammadi, though, is that because it got associated with Gnosticism, people tend to think that all Nag Hammadi texts are the same, have the same message, but they're really different, really different. So some of them are quite a bit like the Bible, some are not. Some of them are really spiritual. Some of them are frankly cuckoo. They're just nuts. They're just weird. I don't know how else to say that. But that doesn't mean that you should discard all of them, because many of them, like I think the Gospel of Thomas, is outstanding. The Gospel of Mary is another example of one that's not in Nag Hammadi, but it's also gaining a lot of popularity just because it seems to show us a lot more about Mary herself. And so that's another example of the fact that there are other texts out there, probably about 100 or so, that are important to know. So thank you for asking that very, very good question.
Another one comes in along the same lines.
Okay.
When we have source documents such as Q, which trickle on down through secondary and tertiary reporters, this questioner asks if it's possible that all of these individuals in the extra-canonical world are just contemporaries reporting the same teachings and the same source in the ways that they remembered them rather than drawing from each other. Or do people explore this kind of reasoning?
Oh yeah, that's another very, very good question. I'm so glad we can just talk about that. The thing about the Nag Hammadi things, as well as all these other extra canonical texts that were not in the canon, is that there are a lot of similarities with them, with the texts that are in the Bible, in that we don't know who actually wrote most of the text of the Bible, especially the Gospels. We do know some of the letters were written by Paul, for example, but even some letters attributed to Paul were not Paul. So there were people who maybe heard from Paul who wrote some things. Same thing with the Gospels in the Bible. They were written by somebody else. And same thing probably with the Gospel of Thomas. That's why I don't think it's Thomas any more than I think it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John who wrote those Gospels. So it's true that somebody heard a story who told a story who told a story, and we don't know how many telephone games there were involved by the time these got written. But what's interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is that it does appear to be, in my mind anyway, one of those really early ones. It has the possibility of being very close to the teachings of Jesus, and without too many translations later. I think, for example, that Matthew elaborated on Thomas. That's why Matthew takes the same kind of ideas but makes them longer and bigger. Now, it could be argued the other way, but it seems logical that Thomas might have come first. That's also why there aren't any stories about, and there aren't any sayings in Thomas that relate to the church doctrine that came up so much later. So well, I also need to make one more point about this, that the first fragments of Thomas were found in Greek, and then later in Coptic, and probably the Coptic ones were later than Greek, trying to copy the Greek, and maybe they changed some things a little bit from Greek into Coptic. So yes, there are changes along the way, and we never know exactly what the first things were, but this is probably fairly close. So I know we're getting kind of close to the closing off time, but do you have anything else, or should we go on?
Well, perhaps two fast ones. Can you
Okay,
comment on the Gospel of Thomas translation by Elaine Pages, and what your opinion on that specific translation is?
Okay, actually, her name is Elaine Pagels, and she is really well known. I love what she has done for these extra canonical texts, because she opened the window and door for people to take them seriously. She said that these are ideas that we have to think about. So I like her translation. Now, it's a little funny about Elaine in that she really reached out to the popular world out there, and so she is not one of those scholars who is taking a position and really arguing it. She's mostly trying to help people see what's going on in the early text. So I would recommend, I think she's got a great translation, so enjoy it.
And how do you spell her last name, just so we can all know?
Pagels. Yeah, Elaine.
Like,
yeah.
Shall we continue?
Yeah, one more then.
Oh, great. Okay, one more. So in the Christian Science world, we have a significant resource with Longyear down in Boston. And one questioner asked if Mrs. Longyear, the original founder of Longyear Museum, ever traveled to Egypt before she founded Zion Research Library.
I wish I knew. That would be fascinating to know that. I will say that the research I've done to find out what Mrs. Eddy knew and didn't know, it could go on and on and on. Because as you know, there's a whole lot of stuff in the Longyear Museum and also in the Mary Baker Eddy Library. But I have found very little. The few quotes I have found are the ones I have brought to you, and I don't know any more than what I've already showed you. I think those few quotes that I've shown you are significant, but I don't think there was much more. Now, and although I will say that last week we talked about the fact that the Christian Science periodicals did cover the story of the discoveries a little bit later than when they kind of came up, but there was one major article, I think it was 1904 or 1903, that covered the latest discoveries, but they didn't seem to indicate that there were any Christian scientists who were involved in any of those that research or archaeology or anything. So I don't think a lot happened in the Christian Science movement. And so I think our time is now, and I don't mean for us to finish the talk. I mean, it's time for Christian Science to get into this, because I think this is a really crucial time for the world to get to know these ideas in an important way. All right, should we finish up?
Yes, after you.
All right then. So I would like to conclude with another look at why the Gospel of Thomas is so important for Christian Science particularly. Last week we did talk about Mary Baker Eddy's interest in the earliest hint of the Gospel of Thomas, because the little fragments she saw corresponded precisely with some of her writings. And in that context, I want to read this again just because it's so important. Oh, I wish you could see a book just sent to me from a professor in Great Britain, giving the words of Christ that have been found in a recently discovered logia, recent excavation, and words not in the canonical Gospels and 200 or 300 years before the Christian era. These words correspond precisely with some of my writings in Science and Health. I only wish the students would all awaken to see the wisdom of what God says through his window. She's talking specifically about appreciating these texts that are not in the canon, but they were important before the Christian era making what began with the Council of Nicaea in 325. How she knew this is really astonishing to me. And really, I am profoundly moved by this myself. And again, this is the week that we've had a chance to look more specifically at some of the sayings and consider what they mean. Oops. So at least in this age, as long as Christian Science continues to be falsely accused of being both Gnostic and heretical, the issues are intertwined with the public reception to the Gospel of Thomas. Since the Gospel of Thomas emphasizes spiritual origin, spiritual understanding, and a spiritual basis for healing, the public discussion about this text helps to open the door to better public conversations about the same issues in Christian Science. This is why I think we are at an important place in history. I think our way of interpreting and understanding the Gospel of Thomas can help turn the Gnostic heresy debate into a profound understanding of Jesus and his healing ministry. That's a pretty important thing to say. So for those of you who have caught the spirit of the value of this ancient text and would like to pursue it a bit more, I want you to know that a colleague and I have created an online course on the Gospel of Thomas called The Gospel of Thomas Goes Public. In case you did not hear about this last week, Dr. Hal Taussig, who is the editor of A New Testament, for some of you who are familiar with that, he helped me to produce this online course. It covers the issues that we mentioned in these last two sessions, but it includes more content of the sayings and more of its history. It just doesn't include things on Mrs. Eddy or Christian Science. The course is always accessible through my website, which is earlychristiantext.com. But if you use this coupon that I'm giving you right now, within 3 days until Saturday night, you can get it for a discount at $9.99. The coupon I shared last week is already expired. They really do only last for 3 days. That's all I can make them for. And this one that you need to use is called Principia Only. So when you go to that website, you'll just type in the words Principia Only for the coupon, and that's how you get that reduced rate. You might also be interested to know that my local Christian Science branch church has a Bible study group who has just finished going through this online course together. And I think we all agreed that doing it together enhanced our study because we loved thinking and learning from each other. You might like to consider doing that very enjoyable experience also. All right, my benediction to you is coming as soon as I turn the screen back over to Heather. So I'm going to, there we go. Heather, you're over to you.
Thank you, Shirley. And thank you for once again expanding our knowledge on this subject and for taking time to answer so many questions this evening. There is certainly a lot to ponder. I know I'll be thinking on all you've shared this month well after the conclusion of this event. And a reminder to everyone tuning in that we've recorded this talk. We'll email you a link to the recording sometime tomorrow. And if you'd like to take Shirley's online course, The Gospel of Thomas Goes Public, we're putting the link to that course in the chat box now, as well as the discount code exclusive to summer session guests. We'll repeat this information in the follow-up email that'll come out this weekend. Our sincerest thank you to all who tuned in this evening. We are appreciative of your support and participation. I'll now turn it back to Shirley for the benediction.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I close with another brief, I have to move this here. Right, we'll get there, just one second. There we go. So I close with another very brief saying from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, love your brother or your sister like your soul. Guard each one of them like the pupil of your eye. Amen. That's the Gospel of Thomas. And thanks so much for coming. Bye.